We have four highly qualified panels this afternoon, and we have asked presenters to try to limit comments to 5 to 7 minutes out of respect for the panels that will be following you, and we will have public comment following the conclusion of our final panel. I would ask each of you to please identify yourself for the record and your affiliation, and want to welcome you all. And will it be Charity Espiritu who will be beginning for the Legislative Analyst's Office? Welcome.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Charity Espiritu with the Analyst's Office. Your committee has asked us to make a presentation today on the Workforce Investment Act system in California as it relates to the Recovery Act. We have prepared a handout that summarizes the key points of our presentation today. I will be going through each page and just really highlight the significant portions of the presentation. So I'll be first doing an overview of the Workforce Investment Act, then moving on to the Recovery Act funds, and then moving on to the questions of accountability and transparency. So we can turn to the first page. This is just a background on the Workforce Investment Act, and as you may know, it was originally passed by Congress in 1998. It replaced the Job Training Partnership Act, or what was known as the JTPA. It gives states and local governments the primary responsibility to consolidate, coordinate, and improve employment and training programs in states. The Employment Development Department, or EDD, distributes Workforce Investment Act funds to three categories of workers: adult, youth, and dislocated workers. Workforce investment programs and services are generally delivered through the one-stop service delivery system. And the California Workforce Investment Board, or what we call as the State Board, assists the governor in designing a statewide plan and establishing program policies, and the legislature has membership on this board. The local workforce investment boards, or what we call our local WIBs, they used to be called PICs, or private industry councils. They're responsible for administering Workforce Investment Act services in 49 local workforce investment areas, or LWIAs. So let's turn to page 2. And this is about the base funding, as Mr. Arambula has said earlier, the base Workforce Investment Act funding formulas and trends. So the first thing to point out is that the Workforce Investment Act prescribes a federal formula for allocating adult, youth, and dislocated worker funds to states. And so the amount that the states receive depends on the total amount of Workforce Investment Act funds available nationally, and also the state's economic and demographic statistics as a relative share of those statistics for all states. We do want to point out that the Workforce Investment Act funds for California have declined over the years. So starting from $630 million in 2001 to about $497 million in the current year. But we also want to point out that, as we will discuss later, the available Workforce Investment Act funding has increased significantly recently because of the Recovery Act dollars. The next thing to point out is that the local workforce investment areas receive about 85% of the state's Workforce Investment Act allocation. While the remaining 15% of the Workforce Investment Act funds are available for state discretionary purposes. So the formula allocation for LWIAs for 2009-2010 is about $422 million, while the amount of state discretionary funds is about $75 million. For the purpose of this hearing, we are focusing on the 85% allocation. And just one thing to note is that for the 15% recently, the legislature has prioritized a portion of Workforce Investment Act discretionary funds for employment and training programs in areas such as veterans training, nurses skills initiatives, and green technology training. So moving on to page 3. Here we're going to discuss the additional Workforce Investment Act funds through the Recovery Act. So as we've said earlier, there's a base funding of $497 million. And so in addition to that, the Recovery Act provided a total of about $488 million for the California workforce investment system for the current year. And so when you combine those base funds and Recovery Act funds, there's a total of about $985 million available for 2009-2010. We have two figures there for you, and the first figure basically shows that the Employment Development Department distributed a total of $837 million to local workforce investment areas. So that's the 85% allocation, and the $148 million for state discretionary. That's the 15%. And the figure two, we break it down a little more in saying that out of that 85%, how much of that went to adult programs, youth programs, and dislocated worker programs. So turning on to page 4, here we're going to discuss the progress on the expenditure of the Recovery Act funds in 2009-2010. And the point here is that there is a new federal spending goal, as Mr. Mani has said earlier. Originally, the Department of Labor required states to expend Recovery Act funds by June 30, 2011. However, the federal government identified a relatively slow pace of Recovery Act expenditures in the local workforce system in some states, including California. So the key here is that California is not necessarily unique in this situation. So therefore, last month in February, they had a meeting, and the Department of Labor established a goal of for local workforce investment boards to expend, not just obligate, 70% of their Recovery Act funds by September 30, 2010, this year. We do want to note that prior to this goal, most local WIBs in California were spending both base and ERA funds concurrently without necessarily, prioritizing Recovery Act expenditures. And so as of December 2009, local WIBs have spent about, here's just an average of about 36% of their Recovery Act adult funds, 23% of Recovery Act dislocated worker funds, and 72% of their Recovery Act youth funds. We do have a figure there that basically just tells you that the expenditure status varies significantly among local workforce investment boards. So if we go, the point is that there's great variance. So if we go through the category of adult, you can see that 19 LWIAs have spent 0 to 30% of their funds. 20 areas have spent about 31 to 69% of their funds, and 10 areas have spent about 70 to 100% of their funds for adult programs. In contrast, most of the local workforce investment boards have spent the Recovery Act funds for youth programs. So turning on to page 5. Here we outline the key federal guidelines to implement the Recovery Act. And so after the enactment of ERA, the Department of Labor issued several guidance letters, or what they call them TEGLs, the Training and Employment Guidance Letters, and to indicate their policy goals and preferences. Generally, the federal government is requiring states to be transparent in their use of the funds and also to spend them timely and effectively. But below, we do, in the handout, we highlight significant guidelines that concern Workforce Investment Act programs. So first is the targeted use of the funds. And basically, the federal government is emphasizing that the local WIB should prioritize service delivery to the unemployed, low-income individuals and recipients of public assistance. And also, the federal government is recommending that they use these funds to invest in green technology training. So those are the targeted use of the funds. The other category is the new opportunities. So when we say new opportunities, it's something that local WIBs are not necessarily doing prior to the Recovery Act. So, the one new opportunity is that local WIBs can now award contracts to community colleges and other eligible training providers to train incumbent workers or unemployed individuals in high-demand occupations. Prior to this new guideline, the local WIBs generally provide individuals with individual training accounts, what they call ITAs, or they call them vouchers, to participate in intensive or advanced skills job training programs. So, here's an issue that you can see where there might be startup issues that may have been one of the reasons why some local WIBs have not spent Recovery Act funds quickly. So moving on to page 6. The main issue here is that the Recovery Act comes with certain accountability guidelines, and so we basically discuss performance measures for ARA. And really the key point here is that because the Recovery Act Recovery Act funds are meant to supplement the regular Workforce Investment Act funds, the Department of Labor did not find it necessary to have separate performance measures. So figure 4 there shows you these ongoing performance measures, that have been collected and are being collected for Workforce Investment Act programs. The only difference is that for the summer youth employment programs, the federal government considers that as something under the Recovery Act, and that there's a separate performance measure that states need to collect for those programs. So it's programs occurring between May 1st and September 30th. And then moving on to page 7, here we're basically dealing with the question of how are Recovery Act and Workforce Investment Act funds and performance accounted for, right? So what is being reported and who reports to whom? That's basically what this page is all about. So the process goes as such that the local workforce investment boards report all Workforce Investment Act activities and expenditures to the Employment Development Department. Then the Employment Development Department aggregates that data and submits that to the Department of Labor. So basically, there are two kinds of reports that the Department of Labor requires from states and from EDD. So one is financial, and then the other is performance. So for all financial reports, the states need to collect the Recovery Act funds and expenditures, as well as the Workforce Investment Act funds and expenditures. And they report that the states, or whatever the state entity is, in this case the Employment Development Department, they report that to the federal government at the end of each quarter. The other is the performance reporting. So under regular Workforce Investment Act, the Department of Labor requires states to submit an annual report and quarterly reports that include participant information that they've collected from Workforce Investment Act services. For the Recovery Act, however, the Department of Labor requires states to provide supplemental monthly participant reports and quarterly reports in addition to the regular Workforce Investment Act reports. So the key thing here is that the federal government wants the reporting to be more frequent than they would otherwise do for the regular Workforce Investment Act. And so we also want to note that the federal government does not require states to distinguish between Recovery Act funded or regular WIA funded participants. So it doesn't quite link up where it's what is not reported is that the Recovery Act funded participants, it doesn't necessarily follow, the money doesn't necessarily follow that person, and that is not reported because they do it. They do this integrated model. The Recovery Act is a supplement to the WIA. So just to summarize the figure 5, we have data elements there. Just to show you a sample of performance measures. So when performance measures, what we mean by what performance measures mean is that mostly it's participant information. So the total number of participants who entered the program, the number of unemployment insurance claimants, and so on and so forth. And so finally, on page 8, we come to our findings and recommendations. And just based on the research we've done and the conversations we've had, the Recovery Act and Workforce Investment Act reports are not easily available to the legislature. We're not saying that they're not available. It's just that they're not available. That the Employment Development Department submits these reports to the Department of Labor directly, and the completed reports are not available on the internet, although ad hoc reporting is available upon request. But based on that, we think the reports should be made accessible, and there are many options by which you can go about this. One is that the EDD could submit copies of these reports to the legislature at least annually and make them available online for the public. Another model is the child welfare model, where the department contracted with a UC system to develop an information technology database that analysts or staffers or anyone can really kind of query and play around with the elements, data elements. So just to wrap it all up, we think that better information and measurements could lead to a better understanding and better outcomes. We'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Spiritu. I would like to ask that we maybe get through all the members of the panel before we open up to questions. If you have an absolutely burning question, I'll be glad to entertain that. But I think let's get as much information on the table as possible, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A. I want to welcome next Mr. Schultz, Senior Advisor to the Governor and Director, California Recovery Task Force. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Monning, Chairman DeSaulnier, Chairman Arambula, Vice Chairman Berryhill, and other members of the committee today. My name is Herb Schultz, and I'm Senior Advisor to the Governor and Director of the California Recovery Task Force. In the past, I've had the honor of working as both Acting Secretary and Undersecretary for the Labor and Workforce Development Agency in the last administration, as well as Acting Director of the Employment Development Department in the current one. I'm very happy to be here today to discuss these issues with you. I'd like to start by discussing the Recovery Task Force's overall role, and then specifically our role in the oversight and distribution of Workforce Investment Act stimulus funds. Approximately a year ago, soon after the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was signed, the Governor created the California Recovery Task Force, made up of the brightest minds from our state, to ensure that Recovery Act funds coming to California were spent as efficiently and effectively as possible. These folks represented over 30 departments, agencies who work in partnership with key stakeholders like the legislature and others across the state to get funds out quickly and efficiently to Californians. We're pleased to report that through the end of 2009, $26.6 billion has been awarded to California, and I'll break it down in two ways. $13.8 billion, or roughly half of that, is being spent to help maintain our vital safety net for millions of Californians: Medi-Cal, food stamps, and unemployment insurance, and other safety net programs. The remaining $12.8 billion has been committed in contracts, grants, and loans, of which $6.3 has been spent already and is out working across the state. The Recovery Act requires extraordinary coordination at all levels of government. We work in partnership to ensure that the benefits of all the programs get to organizations and individuals. We're working every day to provide Californians unprecedented levels of transparency and ultimately to produce jobs and to get the economy back on track, as well as training for jobs. The task force's goal is to provide unparalleled oversight of more than $85 billion in expected cash and tax benefits throughout the life of the Recovery Act, and that $85 billion is for California. One of the main roles in terms of the transparency and accountability is the reporting of these funds, and the reporting of these funds on a quarterly basis. This is a very significant undertaking. The task force, which I lead, is responsible for collecting all state entity data. So all of the awards that come in this last period, 854 awards directly from the federal government to the state and down to 5,600 subrecipients, that's what the task force is responsible for. Now going over to the Workforce Investment Act. The task force's role as it relates to WIA, or WIA funds specifically, includes ensuring that the federal government is providing us with our fair share of funding and working at the statewide level to make certain funds are being spent again efficiently and effectively. As of December 2009, we just heard the figures, so in the interest of time, I won't go through them except to say $488 million in the 85% pot and the roughly $32 million in the discretionary money, and that discretionary money has been spent on green jobs, anti-gang initiatives, and a number of other things that have been in coordination with the legislature. The spending of the 85% will be spread over the 2-year term of the Recovery Act, and we expect all the money to be spent by June of 2011. I want to put a little bit of context on, I think, what EDD and the California Workforce Investment Board are going to talk about on the next panel. But we're pleased to report that the state has met or exceeded every WIA and the 1ARA spending target to date, and I know we'll have a lot of conversation about that, and we have every reason to believe that we will continue experiencing this success for the life of the Recovery Act. Our current reporting trends suggest that almost half of the money that's come in has already been spent by the end of this month, and the public will see this on our quarterly Recovery Act spending report in April. A distinction between ARA, or the Recovery Act, and regular WIA is that we have a quarterly reporting system. The website is www.recovery.ca.gov, and every dollar that comes in from the feds to the states that we then either use for state programs or down into the locals is listed on there. We also pull down from the website monies that go directly from the federal level to the local governmental level, which is the responsibility in terms of the state controller and others to do auditing and oversight. There's also a role for the Federal Department of Labor. They work with EDD to determine the performance measurements, as we've heard, and after the funds are distributed to the state, EDD is solely responsible for measuring the spending and performance metrics for all 49 of the boards. In a later panel where you'll hear from them about their oversight, monitoring, funding, and performance measures that the department oversees, but they oversee in coordination with the task force, with the Federal Department of Labor, with the Bureau of State Audits, with Inspector General Chick, and also the Government Accountability Office. And these activities that you'll hear about include audits, annual audits, biannual compliance monitoring, technical assistance, data validation, performance measures tracking, and ultimately, as we said, the quarterly reporting, which is available, and I will say, on www.recovery.ca.gov. We will be bringing forth next week a sort of revised website. There are maps, and if you have a city that wants to go on in your district and wants to see how much is being spent or how much has been given to that city in dollars, Recovery Act dollars from the state in education or in housing or in transportation, very easy. You click on it and you search for what you need, but it's a very easy thing. And we've also, I should mention, we'll be giving you next week a breakdown of the Recovery Act by Assembly District, Senate District, County, and Congressional District, and that'll come next week. I'd like to underscore a couple other things and end on sort of some of the oversight role that is important to mention. I'd like to underscore how these funds impact Californians who receive them, because while the boards and others provide employment services, work readiness, the big picture fails to tell the individual stories of how the Recovery Act has impacted real Californians, like Mr. Delgado. Mr. Delgado, who served in the United States Marine Corps, was laid off by his employer. And without a job, he eagerly began looking for work, but could not find any. After completing an application for WIA, he enrolled in training at the Northern California Teamsters Driving School. And upon completing the course, Mr. Delgado received a Class A license. He went from worrying about how to pay rent to having a full-time job as a truck driver. And this is a real person, and this is the Recovery Act making a real difference. Throughout the awarding and spending of Recovery Act funds, as we've all mentioned here and will again, oversight is critical to ensure that the money is well spent. That's why Governor Schwarzenegger appointed the first in the nation Recovery Act Inspector General, my colleague Laura Chick, along with other state and indeed federal and local, but from the state, Elaine Howe and her office, the state controller's office, to make sure stimulus funding is spent the right way. And this is our third opportunity to testify together, so at the next one we're going to sing the song together, just in case you'd like to hear it. Very shortly after the formation of the task force, we advised our departments to prepare to implement the Recovery Act through meetings, through conference calls, and what's really been important is ongoing guidance on operations issues by Recovery Act bulletins. And we work with the federal government on those. We work with all of our parties and partners on those. And we meet twice a week as the full task force. We directed the Department of Finance, OSE, State Office of State Evaluations Audits, to go into many of the departments and agencies before we started and see whether they had the internal controls and other mechanisms in place prior to spending the money. These readiness reviews have not only given us valuable information to prevent problems, they've helped us manage problems, and in fact, they've been used as a foundation, if you will, for many of the other audits that have been used and done in the Recovery Act. The task force acts as the primary state contact with federal agencies as well involved in the Recovery Act. And so the Office of Management and Budget, the Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board, and the General Accountability Office. We work with national organizations like the National Governors Association, the state budget officials, and others. So in conclusion, the Recovery Act has provided California with a very unparalleled look into the highest level of transparency and accountability ever associated with government spending, and many lessons have been learned. The quarterly reporting process requires that any recipient of Recovery Act funding provide detailed information more regularly on how taxpayers' dollars are spent than ever before, and this has many implications. And again, many lessons have already been learned. While the Recovery Task Force recognizes the challenges inherent in the size and the breadth of the Recovery Act, there's no task more important than ensuring Californians complete and accurate reports of the use of the funds and getting that fund and all of those funds out quickly, efficiently, and with complete accountability. In short, as I think one of our members said, in short, the task force is committed to making certain every recovery dollar counts. The Recovery Act has provided individuals, businesses, nonprofits, local governments, local education agencies, important financial benefits and opportunities. And we will remain, as a task force, ever vigilant to ensure spending is done efficiently, quickly, but without sacrificing that accountability and real transparency, working obviously with all of our partners, including the legislature. Thank you for inviting me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to move forward. Ms. Chick, Inspector General of the American Recovery Act Funds.
Yes, it's a long title. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us this
Chairman
afternoon.
and members. I am Laura Chick, Inspector General for California's Recovery Act funds, as you just said. It has been almost a year since the governor appointed me Inspector General to oversee these dollars, and my mission has been very clear. I call it the 3 Ds. First, to deter and prevent problems. Then to deter, if there are problems, to find them. And when I do find them, to disclose them. And I am trolling, looking for waste, fraud, and what I call stupid spending. My office is following the stimulus dollars out into the streets, out into the field, to the subrecipient level to see how they are being spent in real time. The challenge actually, and I think you've heard some of this from the LAO's office, some of the challenge has been to find areas where the money has actually already been spent in significant amounts. And one of those areas is the work investment boards, who have received significant dollars already. My very first review has been of a work investment board in the Central Valley, one of the hardest economically hit areas in the state. What we found were some basic accounting problems. In fact, my auditors corrected many of the errors in the WIBS books to be fair to and give credit where it's due to the Work Investment Board. They were running behind my auditors as fast as they could, making corrections wherever we were pointing them out to them. We found that the Work Investment Board had received $3 million for the summer youth program, yet charged $1 million of its overhead to that program. That was clearly not the intent of the Recovery Act. My auditors found that the correct amount that should have been charged for overhead to that program was $60,000, not $1 million. The WIB has agreed and will redirect almost that $1 million back into the summer youth program for this coming summer, but it was not spent last summer when they had it. The report is not about finding problems at one WIB. It's about sharing lessons learned across the state so that others receiving recovery dollars don't make the same mistakes. So both for work investment boards and any other recipients who are having problems with their bookkeeping or other issues. And if we're finding mistakes, we're really pushing hard to get them corrected. My office is finishing reviews as we speak of 2 other work investment boards. We'll be coming out with those reports within the next 3 or 4 weeks at the most. We will probably take a look at some of the, bore down even further and look at 1 or 2 one-stop centers because they are receiving recovery dollars as well. And in closing, I'd like to just step back for 1 minute because I did have experience looking at WIA and work investment boards in my prior role as Los Angeles City Controller. I audited the Los Angeles City Work Investment Board some years ago. And I would say, combined with that joint experience and knowledge, that I'm going to make some broad generalizations. One, and I think it's been made already, there's definitely uneven performance when you look at the 49 WIBs, and if you include the hundreds of one-stop centers, uneven performance, and lots of room for improvement. And I do think that probably more could be done to develop best practice standards and to impose them and to incentivize work investment boards that are to be more successful in connecting workers to the skills and the training that they need in order to compete for quality paying jobs that pay benefits and decent salaries. With that, I'll close.
Thank you, Ms. Chick. And closing out this panel, Ms. Howell from the California State Auditor. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, other chairs, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. A little nervous being sandwiched between the administration, but that's okay. I can handle it, I think. But
am I the administration?
Yes, you absolutely are. What I'm going to quickly talk about is the oversight role that my office, I think I can handle it. My office conducts the single audit, and I'm sure many of you are aware of what the single audit is. It's an audit we conduct on an annual basis of the state's financial statements as well as the state of California's administration of federal programs, variety of different programs at the state. And clearly WIA, that EDD administers, is a huge program that California administers annually. And of course the Recovery Act monies on top of the traditional money that California receives really has helped the state, but also certainly stretch the department itself. So what we embarked on earlier last year after the Recovery Act was signed, we did some quick as we called them, preparedness reviews. We issued one in June, looking at a few departments that historically under the single audit either had major issues or that we knew would be receiving significant increase in dollars. EDD kind of fell in that second bucket where the WIA program typically is around $400 million. Here's another $400 to $500 million the state's going to receive, have to spend those monies in a very relatively short period of time. So in June we went in and looked at, talked to EDD, said what are you intending to change, if anything, to deal with this additional monies that are coming in? Quite frankly, the single audit work that we've done in the past at EDD, we have not come up with major issues. They do a relatively good job of administering the WIA program. In June, when we looked at some of the key areas that they would be responsible for as far as what the federal requirements are. One of them is allowable activities. Are the things that are being paid for with WIA funds allowable under the federal rules? We didn't have any issues there. Cash management. Is the state of California drawing down money too quickly and then having to pay interest? No issues there. Eligibility, same thing. Relatively good process for determining eligibility. The areas where we had concerns in the single audit, and again had a repeat finding this past year in both the single audit for 7-8 and the single audit for 8-9, is on reporting, but an important area is subrecipient monitoring. Reporting was an accounting error. That's not something that's significant. It's something they immediately brought to the federal government's attention, could be reconciled towards the end of the accounting period. That, again, we had to report it to the federal government. It was a concern. EDD immediately contacted U.S. Department of Labor and addressed that issue. Subrecipient monitoring continues to be a struggle. Not just for EDD. It's a struggle for a lot of different state agencies because of resourcing issues and the number of grants or program subrecipients that are out there. So the concern we had is, as you've heard, there are 49 local WIAs. Well, there are also 51 community-based organizations. In the single audit we issued in 7-8, they were able to, EDD, was able to get out and monitor all 49 of those local WIAs. But they had not monitored any of the CBOs. Now, they improved that a little bit in the most recent single audit where they again monitored all 49 local WIAs, but they had only monitored and gone out and taken a look at 5 of the community-based organizations. And EDD certainly acknowledged that this is something that they need to address. It's something we're going to continue to report on because it is a federal requirement. But they did try to take some corrective action, and hopefully they can comment on some of this today. When we were conducting the single audit work for this year, we issued the report early. OMB encouraged state audit shops not to wait to issue the single audit as one huge compiled document, which typically is done 9 months after the end of the fiscal year, which would be the end of this month for fiscal year 8-9. So they said, as you complete projects, get that information out on the street so that the general public is aware, legislature's aware, and certainly the administration's aware of any concerns that we raised during the single audit. So we issued our interim report in January of this year, and subrecipient monitoring was the main concern that we had. In discussing that with EDD, they actually had intended, and hopefully they will have an update for you today, that they were creating some limited term positions using Recovery Act money, certainly allowable, where they could get these individuals out in the field to conduct some of the subrecipient monitoring that was not happening. They also hope to make these positions permanent because, as I said, this has been a concern prior to Recovery Act being implemented. It's just there's a lot of money coming into California under traditional WIA. But also I wanted to indicate that EDD had taken some action to correct some of the other problems. I identified the accounting mistake. Again, that was something they immediately brought to Department of Labor's attention, has been corrected. The other issue that links to subrecipient monitoring, and again, this is something that's pretty consistent across different state agencies, the local entities, in addition to my office conducting the single audit at the state level, a local entity under federal rules, if they expend $500,000 or more in federal money, they have to have a single audit done at the local level. So either a local CPA firm is coming in or maybe one of the major CPA firms. Those single audit reports are submitted to the state centrally through the state controller's office. What the state controller's office does with those reports is, first of all, assure that they've been conducted in compliance with, as we have to follow, standards. So make sure those reports are acceptable, those audit reports. Then if there are findings in those reports, they send those to the appropriate agency. So, for example, if the controller's office got an audit report of a community-based organization and there were issues that local auditor identified in the single audit, they need to get that over to EDD so EDD can work with that local entity to make sure that they've established a corrective action plan that's going to address the issues. There's a time frame for that. Those corrective action plans basically have to be reviewed and approved by the state entity. So EDD has to see the corrective action and has to approve it within 6 months of that audit report being sent to the state of California. In some cases, that 6-month time frame was not being met. part of the responsibility lies with the Comptroller's Office because they were not getting the audits to EDD and other state agencies. This has been an issue we've reported in the single audit in the past. What I'm pleased to say is when we conducted the single audit work this year at EDD, they had been proactive, working with the Comptroller's Office, establishing a better tracking method, and when we tested this, we found that they were complying with the 6-month requirement and reaching out to those local entities that had been audited that had findings. So we think that has been resolved. But still, the subrecipient monitoring continues to be an issue, but having those local audits done by CPA firms at the local level helps mitigate some of the risk with subrecipient monitoring. So that was really the main finding that we had with regard to the WIA program this year. One thing I just think members need to keep in mind, you asked about recommendations. One of the things that I think EDD would acknowledge that would be perhaps a best practice for them is if they're receiving the single audits from the locals, do some kind of risk assessment of those local entities, because if you can't audit all of them or monitor all of them, let's come up with some kind of risk-based approach to identify those that have had continuous problems in the past. Look at those that intend to spend a significant amount of dollars, because if you have the risk at the state level, which is the way we assessed risk to determine where we were going to look, the state agencies, and EDD in particular, could do the same thing. So if there are certain local boards that traditionally get $50 million under WIA and now they're getting $150 and they have to spend it now by September, in my mind that raises a red flag, and that becomes a risk factor and a determinant in where do we use our scarce resources to go out and monitor these different local entities. So that would be a recommendation that I would make to the legislature and certainly to the administration as far as the kinds of things we can do to mitigate risk to make sure that the funds are being used appropriately and spent as efficiently as possible. I'm going to stop there and offer up any answers, any questions members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. And for all members of the panel, I'd like to defer to Co-Chair DeSaulnier to see if he has questions, and then we'll go to Arambula, and then we'll open it up to members.
I'll just try to be brief for the Inspector General. What led you to do this particular, the Tulare board?
Some practical things and, well, anyway, one, we chose work investment boards because they'd spent a lot of money. We chose Tulare because it wasn't, we chose that Central Valley WIB because it wasn't a huge, enormous work investment board that would take months for my brand new teams of auditors to go in and look at. We also chose it because it wasn't geographically too far away, so some of it was very pragmatic. I had just received 2 teams of 4 auditors each after the first of the year, was eager to get them out, and so looked at a variety of factors and chose 3 work investment boards based on amount of money, how much had been spent, size, geographic location, what my brand new folks could handle as a first assignment. And that's really how we ended up with that one.
And a $3 million budget with a difference of $940,000 between what they were going to spend in administration and what you suggest, that's obviously huge. So
yeah.
Wouldn't that, I mean, obviously it stood out there, but I'm concerned that this may be a pattern that's happening other places in terms of risk assessment, sort of what both of you said. How do you use your dollars best to make sure we prevent those kind of actions? Because if you hadn't captured that, what might have happened?
I don't know. I've asked that, myself and of my staff. Would it have been caught? There's a possibility. Would they have caught it themselves? There's a possibility. Would it have been caught later by the feds and maybe we'd have to return it? That's a possibility.
And who would have returned it if it had already been spent? Would that have come to the state?
Well, without... I have done a cursory review of the report that the Inspector General. Well, the reason I discussed the accounting issue that we identified, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I looked at the discussion in the report, it was $1 million for overhead. The issue was the local board did not currently have an accounting code for youth activities. It's not that those monies, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not that those monies were spent on overhead. They were spent on appropriate activities. They were just accounted for as overhead because they didn't have a code set up yet to separately identify it as Recovery Act dollars. Because what the Recovery Act specifically requires, and we have to do it as part of the single audit work we do at the state level, is make sure that state agencies have, for example, EDD. In the schedule of federal financial assistance, which is a listing of all the federal money that comes into California by program, we have to show WIA, traditional, and then WIA era. So all the state agencies had to work with the controller's office to set up separate accounting codes for the Recovery Act money so we could track it separately. It's my understanding, and again, it's Laura's report, so it's my understanding that it was an accounting problem, not necessarily the funds being misspent. So I don't know whether, if the feds came in, I think they would say the same thing Laura said. You've got a problem with your accounting practices. You need to get these codes established and be able to track the expenditures, but not that there was an inappropriate use of the funds.
Correct on accounting technicalities, but the fact was $1 million was charged to overhead and wasn't spent on summer youth, and is going to be now. So I don't know what would have happened if we had not found it. And what's interesting to me is we got some pushback both from the state and from the feds about some of the other things that we called out in the report. And I think the LAO even mentioned that they don't necessarily need to track the ARA completely separate from the other. But the Recovery Act makes very, very clear that they want the dollars kept separately. And what's interesting is, even though I haven't put out those other reports, they're in draft form. We're finding mixed performance across just these 3 examples. So one of the work investment boards we're looking at did exactly what they were supposed to do, tracked it separately, had all of the funds accounted for. This one was messy and sloppy. Not criminal wrongdoing. We didn't label it, inappropriate expenditure. So the auditor is correct. These were all bookkeeping and accounting mistakes, but at the end of the day, it translates into not the best use of the money.
Mr. Chairman, I won't take more of the committee's time, but it does seem this is an area that we should pursue a little bit vis-a-vis risk assessment.
If I could just follow up on that, and I'm going to defer to Mr. Arambula in a moment here, but just on this issue that we're discussing, how many of the 49 local WIAs, you gave the example of the Central Valley, how many others have you been able to?
There's 2 others right now that we're coming out with reports on. I do plan to look at more. I will not be looking at all 49. I would say at the end of the day, I might look at 2 more.
So my question then for anyone, what is the enforcement mechanism for those that you don't get to with your team? What are the built-in mechanisms for oversight, enforcement, or incentivizing?
Well, I think one of the things is EDD getting out and conducting subrecipient monitoring. They do get out to all 49. We identified that in the 07 single audit and the 08-09 single audit, and did some of the monitoring. Clearly, Laura's group, when they went out, identified some accounting issues with regard to the Central Valley. So there is that. There also, as I said, is for those boards or local WIAs that actually spend more than $500,000. That's a threshold the federal government has established. They have to have a single audit done, which is basically a local auditor conducting the same types of tests that my office does at the state level. They're doing it at the local level. So again, that's something that I think EDD should be using in their risk-based approach for prioritizing perhaps where they're going to go and which of these local entities they're going to audit. I have a fairly significant concern about the CBOs, because those are entities that in the past they haven't been able to monitor. They need to continue to look at the 49 local WIAs, but again, perhaps do a risk assessment of those, and if there are some of those that have been pretty consistently doing a good job, and perhaps based on some of the work Laura's doing are doing a good job, then let's shift our efforts and perhaps look at some of these CBOs that we haven't been out to in 2 or 3 years. So anyway, that's my thought.
When I talk about one-stop centers, I mean community-based organizations.
Thank you.
EDD, I think we'll go into it in great detail, but in summary, there's sort of two sides to EDD, and the one is that programmatic side, and where Elaine says they're going out and they are doing monitoring, they're looking at the program. There also is the review side, that is the monitoring. It's not an actual audit, it's Department of Labor regulations. The reason that I'm separating it is that that division comes up in regular WIA and now with ARA with corrective action plans, but it is the sole responsibility of the department then to take those corrective action plans, to get them to the regional folks, to be able to look at that, and you can retrieve money back. You can go under federal law as far as decertifying the Workforce Investment Board itself. So there's a series of enforcement actions that can be taken everywhere from this is disallowable, you owe it back to the state, which means the feds, or you can, ultimately be end of the road, and a new WIB would have to be reconstituted.
Thank you. Mr. Rumble.
Thank you. Most of my questions were answered, thankfully, by the previous speakers, but with regard to the subrecipients, it was mentioned that EDD would be adding some limited term positions to its compliance process or compliance section, and that those might be made permanent. Do we know? Do you know if EDD has in fact submitted a budget change proposal for those positions, or is this something that is just being discussed?
I think Dennis can go into it in more detail, but those folks have come on. I think there's 4 or 5. They have plans to hire 2 more, so some are already in the pipeline, if not already started. And Mr. Petrie on the second panel will have the detail. But it's gone far beyond the planning stage, and I think now moving sort of forward, they've got the additional. It doesn't, obviously, I think, take into account, you can always utilize additional ones probably in order to be looking at CBOs and things like that, but the department moved quickly to be able to fill the limited terms and try and move them forward.
May I? I think sometimes, because the state hands out a lot of money, and there are a lot of subrecipients, but I think we should also be careful that it's not always a question of more sets of eyes or increasing resources, but changing how we do things. And I just want to give an example because I think transparency in reports was mentioned by the LAO. When I first arrived here, I was meeting with, actually with EDD and I think the compliance division. Very interested when I heard that they have auditors and compliance review folks and that they go out and do these reports. So I was very eager in asking, can I go online and see these? The answer was, we don't put these online. That is not going to be the case, or it isn't the case now already, because the governor issued an executive order directing all of his departments to put audits, reports, investigations, et cetera, on his transparency website. And I really think some of it is, what do we do when we find problems? And if the culture is to, we don't want to air dirty laundry and we don't want to embarrass anyone and we don't want to cause problems, then nothing changes. That you can ask for corrective action plans, but if you don't push hard to have those things implemented, nothing changes. And an example of that was a very excellent report done by EDD of one of the largest WIBs in the state, and it was repeat findings over and over and over again in the report and unresolved issues. So maybe sometimes instead of more resources, it's using them differently and maybe rotating people who are monitoring community-based organizations, so when you start getting a very friendly relationship after a year or two, it's time to move on.
Is EDD the one that is responsible for ensuring that non-compliance is corrected?
Yes.
Okay. And in the opinion of the three of you, is there anything the legislature should do in terms of allocating resources, both available federal or state resources, to ensure that we are doing adequate compliance and performance evaluations?
My recommendations would be the same that I've given in testimony before the joint legislative. I'm going to get the name wrong. Chairman DeSaulnier, what is the name? The Reform Committee.
Accountability and
Improving state government, a very high goal that we've set. Virtually impossible.
Right. That the legislature could, in its committee hearings, both in using reports from my office, certainly from the state auditor, especially performance audits and program evaluations, be given a roadmap for holding departments' feet to the fire.
Okay. And if you know, if a subrecipient, a CBO, is found to have misused funds, and it's not possible to recover those funds, is there any responsibility on the part of the local Workforce Investment Board?
Gee, I think the feds would be
well,
interested.
I think that the feds, because what happens is the U.S. Department of Labor every other year does an extensive audit of EDD and all of the divisions that get federal money. It would be EDD's responsibility to, take that money, and if they're not taking money that's disallowable, that's going to show up in a federal audit. When I was EDD director, for example, we went through that whole audit process, and it was weeks, and it was dozens of people coming out and sort of scattering across the state. So yes, there's a check on the department's role by the Department of Labor. The other thing that I just wanted to answer is what you just asked, and I think it's important to state, and I think there's probably a lot of partnership between the administration, between the legislature, between interested parties, is reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act. It is long overdue. It is strongly recognized as needing to be scrupulously looked at, as originally JETPA was, as CETA. I'm old enough to have remembered in 1980 CETA when I first went to work for my home district congressman. But same general program. But in all sincerity, that is something that I believe, and we talked about that we do believe it's overdue, and we believe there's a lot of commonality in the legislature, the administration, and in the stakeholder community about doing that. I mean, we've heard things that the president is sort of interested in doing it. It would be good to see us moving forward and really trying to work together to position California and the rest of the country for reform.
And just a final question, Mr. Chairman. The funds to pay for the staff, the resources that are necessary to do the compliance reviews, are those not reimbursable through the same federal funds? So it's not an additional general fund expense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Members, questions? Senator Leno.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question for Ms. Espiritu.
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned in your presentation that when it was identified that the local WIBs were spending both their base and their ARA funds concurrently, that the Department of Labor then set this date of September 30th to have 70% of the ARA funds expended. What are the consequences if that's not the case?
Well, based on the discussions we've had with the departments, this new date is a goal, not necessarily in statute. And so, I mean, the answer that we got is that they're trying real hard to push local WIBs to spend this amount, 70% by that date.
Ultimately, Senator, what happens is that the federal government, especially under ARA, could redirect the money, and the governor has made it very, very clear that we will not lose $1 that comes in on ARA, and he can speak specifically to where they are. But especially with the ARA funds, it's the redirection to other states. We have lists, quite frankly, because we want to be prepared. Other states may not be spending theirs. For example, transportation. Transportation Commission has told us exactly what the priority is if we get more money.
And so we are monitoring the expenditure, and do we know that this threat of September 30th or this threatened goal of September 30th
yes,
is in fact?
I think Dennis will go completely through it. We are very confident that we are going to and have never missed a target, and that we will get through that. Last summer, we had 6 weeks when the summer youth program came out. to put together a program that had not happened in 10 years. And so the department put it through, met the 70% threshold by September 30th, and was working on some of these other programs for dislocated workers and adults, and then they have to scale up. So we're very confident that they will make the 70% goal for adults and dislocated workers similar to the way that they did the summer youth program in September.
All right, so we can all relax. There's no need
well,
for vigilance.
We don't relax. I mean, that's one of the things that I can say as the Recovery Task Force, and the lessons that we've learned is that this is not only complicated, but it's absolutely necessary. And the public expects it, and the legislature expects it, and everybody expects that you're going to spend the money efficiently and effectively and not just fast. And that's been some of the challenge with the Workforce Investment Act, ARA stuff, as well as everything else ARA. You know, you just sort of, here's 488 additional, $1 million. The positive thing with WIA is that they just put it on top. We have programs in the Energy Commission where they had to create 7 out of 8 new programs in order to take that money and spend it. And we've sort of turned a corner there.
And none of the WIA funds have to go through the Office of Historic Preservation?
There is no backlog.
Thank you.
In both, I should say, there is absolutely no backlog in both ARA and non-ARA with there. And I'll tell you one thing that we learned is that when I started doing this job 10 weeks ago and we were having the last 5 in that backlog, it wasn't state entities. It was 5 federal agencies. So our cabinet, one cabinet deputy, got on the phone with the Department of Veteran Affairs here and said, could you call the VA up there? And in one day, I had this federal guy telling me, I know it's raining all over the place, but we will have people out at the cemetery, and if it's raining, they're going to be in scuba gear because we're going to be in trouble with the federal government that we're the ones that are creating the problem for California. So we're doing everything we can.
I want to thank members of this panel. I want to thank those representing the governor's office, the state auditor, LAO's office. I think you have positioned California to be proactive in the monitoring of this. There remains work to be done, but you've, I think, engendered some confidence that we have a system in place. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And while this panel disengages, I would invite members from EDD to come forward, and from the California Workforce Investment Board, our second panel, while they work their way forward to give their testimony. Welcome new members who have joined us, Mr. Chesbro, Mr. Eng. And I would like to remind our members of this second panel not to follow the lead of the first panel in terms of the time allocation. I would urge you to be adherent to our 5 to 7 minute rule. If possible, maximize time for question and answer, which is where I think we can also gain a lot of information and insight. We have the sergeants handing out some information. In the interest of time, I would like us to get started. Mr. Petrie, Deputy Director, Workforce Services Division, EDD, would ask each of you to, again, for the record, introduce yourself and your affiliation as we go through the testimony. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, committee chairs and members. My name is Dennis Petrie, and I am the Deputy Director of the Employment Development Department for the Workforce Services Branch. It's a pleasure to appear before you today to discuss the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. As I go forward, I'll be using the acronym ARA, or Recovery Act, to just talk about the workforce development allocations and expenditures. The Employment Development Department plays 2 roles regarding the Recovery Act and the General Workforce Investment Act program. One role is our charge as the state's WIA fiscal agent to provide mandated administration and oversight of the WIA program in California, and the other is as a direct service provider in partnership in the One-Stop Career Center system, delivering the Wagner-Pizer Act Job Services Program. The invitation I received for this afternoon's hearing asked me to speak primarily to 3 different questions and/or concerns. First, what is the current status of ARA WIA expenditures in relation to deadlines and goals established in law? or by the U.S. Department of Labor? Second, how are WIA funds being expended, and what accountability measures are in place to ensure proper spending? And lastly, what, if any, performance measures exist to evaluate the use of such funds? My comments are organized to respond in order to those questions, and my comments and testimony is before each of you now. I'd like to start off by saying there's been some confusion regarding whether baseline WIA funding and ROWIA funding are distinctly different programs, each with an independent set of goals, expectations, and outcomes. So let me clear that up immediately. The Recovery Act funds are a supplement to the existing regularly funded Workforce Investment Act program resources. The U.S. Department of Labor Training and Employment Guidance Letters, known as TEGLES, the tool used to provide states the policy guides and expectations of the Department of Labor as it pertains to WIA and specifically to ARA-WIA funding. The ARA-TEGLE elaborates on the importance of integrating the two funding sources to achieve the desired outcomes of the program. For example, to increase employment and training services that will assist workers to connect with the labor market. Therefore, for reporting purposes, ARA participants are considered as participants in the regular formula programs and must be included in all current performance reporting requirements for the respective programs. Although we track ARA-WIA spending with a different, unique grant code, the funding blends with WIA baseline funding and is used to perform all the same services and programs as does baseline WIA. ARA-WIA is not any more or any less restrictive than baseline WIA. The only exception to this is the ARA-WIA youth funding stream, which was to be used exclusively to implement a summer youth employment program with an emphasis on spending the lion's share of that youth funding during the summer of 2009. I am pleased to report that California achieved that goal by expending 72% of that allocation during the summer of 2009. Any remaining ARA youth funds will support a summer youth employment program in 2010. Regarding ARA-WIA adult and dislocated worker funding, the United States Department of Labor recently and informally communicated with the states in early February 2010 that the expenditure goal target for those funds is to achieve a 70% expenditure rate by September 30th, 2010, and re-emphasized the formal expenditure target of 100% expenditure by June 30th, 2011. The formal guidance on the ARA Wagner-Pizer funding stream remains the same, which is to achieve a 100% expenditure rate by September 30th, 2010. For all three of these ARA funding streams, adult, dislocated worker, and the Wagner-Pizer Act, the state is on track to meet these expenditure goals and requirements. The expenditure analysis done at EDD supports this claim. Using a straight-line projection of all ARA-WIA expenditures based on the first 2 quarters of available data, we estimate California will be about 66% expended as of the quarter ended September 30th, 2010. Because the first quarter contains significant one-time expenditures for the summer youth program, we use the amount expended in the second quarter, which is about $49 million, for straight-line projection purposes. We assumed expenditure levels of about $49 million in all succeeding quarters. This is a very conservative approach to projecting expenditure levels. Many local area administrators have said that their expenditure rates have increased significantly, and if that holds true, the state will easily meet the September 30th benchmark and will be well positioned to expend all ARA-WIA funds before the end of their availability, June 30th, 2010. Federal spending requirements on the Workforce Investment Act. As prescribed within the Workforce Investment Act, funds are appropriated for 3 programs, the Adult, Youth, and Dislocated Worker programs. Based on formulas mandated within the Workforce Investment Act, the Secretary of Labor provides an allotment of funds to the states for each of these 3 funding streams. The Secretary has no discretion on these allotments. The formula considers such factors as the amount of unemployment and the number of disadvantaged individuals within the state. States have 3 years to spend each annual allotment. States are required to distribute funds to the local workforce investment areas for the WIA youth, adult, and dislocated worker programs based on formulas set in law. Local areas are required by law to receive 85% of formula, adult, and youth funds, and 60% by formula for the dislocated worker funds. Local areas have 2 years to spend these funds, but must have obligated at least 80% of the funding received by the end of the first year. If 80% requirement is not met, funds may be recaptured from those local areas not meeting that obligation requirement. If funds are recaptured, they are redistributed to those local areas that meet the obligation requirement. Funds provided for the youth program must be spent both on in-school and out-of-school activities. However, the Workforce Investment Act further requires that at least 30% of youth formula funds must be spent on out-of-school activities. Federal spending requirements of the Wagner-Peiser Act, funds provided through the annual agreement for the Wagner-Peiser Act program have a spending life of 3 years and must be expended in accordance with all applicable federal statutes, regulations, and policies. Funds are not distributed in the same fashion as the WIA, but are used by the state to provide employment services to job seekers and employers. Services include, but are not limited to, job search assistance, job referral, placement assistance for job seekers, reemployment services to unemployment insurance claimants, and recruitment services to employers with job openings. Now, regarding the second topic.
Mr. Petrie, if I can just interrupt, you've used close to 10 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And we do have 2 more panels after this one. We all have your testimony in front of us. Could I ask you maybe to conclude by highlighting your final 2 points as opposed to reading the entire testimony?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
As per the question, if there are any performance measures exist to evaluate the use of these funds, the previous panel, especially the LAO, had gone through all of those particular criteria and performance goals. There is a number of charts and documents that I provided to you that will speak to the performance achieved over the last 3 years of the WIA program. Because the ARA program is still in existence and the fiscal year has not concluded, we do not have data for the most recent state fiscal year. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, clarify any comments or concerns that you may have, and it's a privilege to be here with my good friend and colleague from the State Workforce Investment Board. Who's
turning it over to me now?
Great. Well, Mr. Petrie, I want to thank you, and I apologize for cutting you short, but I think we'll maximize time for Q&A, and you might be able to underscore some of the points that you didn't get to make in your affirmative testimony. I think we have next Mr. Evashenk. Is that correct? Will you be testifying next from the EDD?
That is correct,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. I was asked to attend only because Mr. Petrie may not have been able to be here, so I don't have any further comments at this time, but I am available to help answer any questions that the committees may have.
Thank you, and I do appreciate your joining us this afternoon, and appreciate the brevity of your affirmative testimony.
I gave him my 6 minutes.
Thank you. Well, then we should give him a little bit more, but we'll keep moving here, and we'll welcome Ms. Halsey from Workforce Investment Board. Welcome.
Thank you, chairs and committee members. Barbara Halsey, Executive Director, California Workforce Investment Board. We'll see how long my voice holds out. I may have to call for a glass of water. The lovely weather has affected me with my seasonal allergies, and so we're working through that at this point. I wanted to share briefly with the committees what the California Workforce Investment Board was called upon to do in response to the receipt of Recovery Act funding. Most importantly, this document represents the strategic vision for the implementation of employment and training provisions of the Recovery Act. This document was required to be developed by the State Workforce Investment Board in partnership with the Employment Development Department and the Labor Agency as a condition of receiving the Recovery Act funding. I just came from a Green Collar Jobs Council meeting, and in the interest of being green, I did not make copies of this for all committee members, but it is on the board's website, California Workforce Investment Board, cwib.ca.gov, under plans, and if you wish to look at that, I would invite you to do so. Basically, what I would like to share with you is in looking at how California was going to implement the strategic use of Recovery Act dollars throughout the state, we found ourselves to be well positioned. In 2006, SB 293 passed. SB 293 called for the state board to develop a state workforce strategy. We took that very seriously. In 2008, the State Board adopted formally sectoral strategies as the framework we were going to use as the big umbrella for aligning plans of the multiple systems critical to workforce development within the state. We've done that work through the Green Collar Jobs Council most recently. What we're seeing as a result of that economic competitiveness strategy being implemented is greater alignment between workforce development, economic development, education, and our community partners. We're very excited about the changes that we're seeing in the system. With the Recovery Act money, we also understood there was an opportunity for the state to be more visionary in what we were doing. So while we heard the call to spend it well and spend it fast, we also heard be strategic in what you're doing. Recently, the State Board announced awards to 10 collaboratives. Those collaboratives will be working on doing economic diagnostics, understanding the industry clusters of opportunity that are available in their economies so that we can do long-term a better job of aligning what's going on in terms of demand sectors with our economy to the production of the talent necessary to supply those sectors. We're very excited about the opportunity that ARA gave us to do that kind of alignment. I would also like to bring your attention to the report that was passed out to you. It's the board's most recent annual report. You heard from your previous panel that we're required to do an annual report. This gives highlights of what's going on at the local level, what are the larger state initiatives that we're working under, and most importantly, on pages, beginning on page 32, through the end of the report, provides you with WIA Title I performance highlights, those Title I programs, adult dislocated worker and youth programs, that have been achieved over the past several years, so that you can see on a comparative basis where California has been stacking up in terms of its ability to achieve its performance goals on the long-term level. The other thing I would like to leave the panel with, just a couple of thoughts. Last week, I had the opportunity to attend National Governors Association meetings in Washington, D.C. We were addressed by the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Jana Oates. Ms. Oates shared with us that since the inception of the Recovery Act money, 35 million Americans have taken advantage of the workforce system in this country. Of that 35 million, 7.7 million have entered into one of the doors of the one-stop system. They received assistance with information on jobs that might be available, supports with child care, supportive service monies, assistance with identifying training programs or connections to jobs that would get them and their families back on their feet in rapid order. The other comment I would like to make is, as we were looking at the receipt of the Recovery Act funding in February of last year, I believe California's unemployment rate stood at some 10%. If we look at California's unemployment rate today, we stand at 12.5%. So as this committee considers whether or not our expenditures of these critical resources are being done expeditiously enough, I would also caution that we've got to be strategic about what we're doing. We anticipate this jobless recovery to last for some time. We anticipate high unemployment rates for some time. So I really believe it's incumbent upon us as good stewards of scarce resources to take into consideration where we are today, where we were when the Recovery Act passed, and where we anticipate we're going to be for the next 2 to 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Housley. Mr. Rambla, any questions?
Thank you. Let me share something with you, and perhaps you can help me understand how we can address this issue and maybe use it to improve the delivery of services. Yesterday, our committee had a hearing covering the Department of Corrections, specifically their mental health needs. There were a large number of vacancies that they have been unable to fill, and they've been contracting using the equivalent of a traveling nurse, if you will, or registries, I believe they're called. There were in the probably 400 vacancies, and some of them granted are very highly technical and specialized, but a number of them were psychiatric technicians or paraprofessionals. I asked the question, have you worked with EDD? Have you worked with our employment training programs to let them know of your need? Because these are permanent positions and they're well paid, and we're currently paying more for outside help than if we did it in-house. My understanding is that we don't on a consistent basis work with other state departments to see what their training needs are and then look for ways to try to provide that assistance. You may wish to follow up with the medical receiver's office on their particular issue, but it opened up a window for me to consider what other unmet needs are out there, and is the left hand speaking with the right hand to make sure that there is an awareness of what those needs are and an opportunity to use some of these funds in a way that would be particularly helpful in terms of reining in some of the exorbitant costs for medical care for inmates. And there could well be many other situations like that I'm not aware of. This is just something that arose within the last 24 hours. I'm told that they tried to get some help near or in conjunction with a medical facility that they're proposing to operate in the northern Central Valley, and were turned down. So I'm wondering, are we in fact coordinating our resources as best as we should to meet our own needs? So I'm hoping you can address that.
Yeah, Chairman, may I follow up with you on who you were speaking with so that I make sure I make the right connection? But certainly we want to make connections with the medical receiver's office to understand what their needs are. I will tell you that within the past year, we did have conversations with the receiver's office about what their workforce needs were. The overarching strategy from the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, the California Workforce Investment Board, and our partner local boards has been to focus on the sector needs, on the industry needs, as opposed to a particular employer within the industry. So we did dedicate, with the legislature's approval, a great amount of funding toward nursing workforce capacity building. We now find ourselves in a situation where some of those nurses are having difficulty finding jobs because of the current economic situation. So I'd be most interested in reconnecting with the receiver's office and seeing if there's something we can do to assist them with their needs and better understand what the future needs may be.
And it could well be that there are other areas of the state that are receiving federal funds. In construction, for example, if we're going to ramp up, it might make sense to look for ways to encourage people to be prepared to be part of that growing industry. And so I'm interested in finding a way to systematically assess what the state's needs are and make sure that they are reflected or taken into account in terms of how we expend the ARA workforce investment monies.
Well, and we're, from a board perspective, very interested in that as well, and it's one of the reasons why we were thrilled that the legislature approved in the governor's budget the regional industry clusters of opportunity grants that I spoke of earlier. We have 10 regional collaboratives that will be receiving funding. That funding is specifically designed to assist our local workforce investment boards to come together, better diagnose what's going on within their economies, understand the kinds of educational, community-based, and economic development as well as business partnerships that they need to create so that as demand emerges in the economy or as demand ebbs in the economy, we position ourselves in the correct way. Are we ramping up education programs in order to supply talent to emerging need, or are we beginning to understand how we should be transitioning individuals from one industry into another industry as we see that churn happen naturally in California's economy. That's the impetus, that's the focus of those regional clusters of opportunity grants. So I'll look forward to telling you about how those grants proceed.
And then on a different matter, Mr. Chairman, with regard to oversight or compliance, is EDD requesting approval by the legislature for staffing changes as part of the budget proposal that was submitted by the administration?
Yes, in the current year, we had a finance letter that requested a number of positions because of the receipt of the ARA monies.
Okay. I would just convey the message that if you feel that you need additional compliance staff, I know a lot of money came in rather quickly, and sometimes it's hard to play catch up. But just to let you know that our desire is not to play gotcha. Our desire is to come up with a system that makes sense and that operates well. And to the extent that you need personnel or resources to do that, I think you would find a receptive audience.
Thank you, Mr. Rombla. And we have brought on 9 additional individuals in the compliance and monitoring review section to attend to some of the outstanding issues that were discussed previously.
Thank you. I did have a couple of questions. First, Mr. Petrie, in terms of some of the data that you didn't get to analyze for us in your testimony, but in terms of the success of placing people into jobs, do you have any data that breaks down what types of jobs people are securing? Is there a breakdown by industry, by type of work, or is that something you can get for us? We have statistics of the amount of funds expended and then performance data, employed, retention rate, average earnings, et cetera. Is there any breakdown as to where we're being most successful?
In terms of industries or sectors that these individuals are gaining employment?
Yes.
I would have to double check on that. I know we have demographical data, and we have the, of the participants served, how many got into a job and how many retained, and what are the average salary
because
compensations.
Part of my follow-up to that is, what confidence do we have that the placements that are taking place will lead to longer-term employment once the ARA funds have been expended? Are these job placements positioning people to become independent in their employment and have some longer-term employment future?
Yeah, and I do believe that we can provide that information, but it's information that's going to lag because we use the base wage file as the way that we validate. So if I'm a local workforce investment program operator and I submit that I've placed an individual, I don't get verification of that placement until that individual shows up in the quarterly data in the base wage file, and there's a lag there. So it's possible, but we always have to adjust because of the lag time we see in how that data becomes available. But I do believe it's possible for us to get that.
That would be helpful, and kind of related to that, I think our interest is that as much as possible we are looking to the future. I think a lot of the historic job training has been in construction and building trades, and some of the stimulus is supporting that infrastructure development, but we know there's a huge drop-off in housing. And so maybe some of the programs that positioned workers to go into a paying job because of the recession, that's not necessarily the arena where the training matches available jobs. So I am curious, how are we being strategic in linking this stimulus money to where we think our economy is going in terms of growing jobs?
So, sorry, Mike. No. I'm on a roll.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned earlier that I had just come from the Green Collar Jobs Council meeting, and I think it provides a good example of exactly that, how we're looking at organizing. We're working with the Energy Commission, with the Public Utilities Commission, with EPA and the Air Resources Board, with our partners in education, K-12, community colleges, and universities, to make sure that we're aligning the preparation of workforce to how those jobs in that green economy are going to emerge, and that we're getting the timing right, because we're all very concerned. Let's be honest about what the Workforce Investment Act is. It's not a job creation program. It's training for jobs. So we have to be very conscious about how we're looking at the economy and where opportunity will emerge, and then timing our training programs to produce talent to that emerging opportunity. So the Clean Energy Workforce Training Program was our first large collaborative workforce training initiative, where we took some of the ARA funding that had come into the Energy Commission and some of the AB 118 monies, along with some of the governor's 15% discretionary funding, combined those into a leveraged investment pool for the purpose of funding training programs in energy efficiency, renewables, renewable fuels, and building retrofit, I believe. I have it right in front of me. I can look. But we have 34 programs now running throughout the state that are bringing people in, some of them dislocated construction workers, some of them returning veterans, some of them low-income individuals who haven't had opportunity in the economy, and moving those individuals through training programs, requiring that there be a set of employers who are ready to hire, who are guiding how those training programs are being designed and implemented, and then on the output side, producing talent to those employer specifications. So we're very excited about that.
And I would appreciate, I think it would be helpful for all of us to see where is the growth, where's the future of our state's economy moving, and how is the training syncing with that. Kind of related to that, I have a question. When you determine that a local workforce investment board has not been keeping pace with the expectations for disbursement, how, other than trying to encourage them to step it up, do you have the ability to transfer, reallocate funds to an area that's maybe expended its funds? It could use that allocation more efficiently than a local board that's not expending the funds.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have that authority within the statutes of the law. As I alluded to in my testimony, the local areas must be 80% obligated by the end of the first year. And we do monitor that very closely. And if there seems to be a challenge, we offer technical assistance. In the 7 years that I've been with the Employment Development Department, Mr. Chair, we have not, I cannot recall a time where a deobligation of funds for one local area took place and got transferred to another as a result of lack of achieving the goals and the measures and the outcomes.
But that authority does exist, and it's part of your ongoing monitoring?
That is correct.
So between now and September, if we see that for whatever reasons a certain allocation is not likely to meet that expenditure, you have the authority, we have the authority to move that to a higher producing board?
The authority that the governor has is associated with obligation levels. There is not authority to pull money back for failure to expend the 70% by September 30th. Instead, we use a more of a carrot approach. In addition to the compliance monitoring and the other oversight activities that you heard about in the first panel, we also have technical assistance and capacity building staff in our program area. All the compliance area in EDD is a separate branch from the Workforce Services branch to maintain independence and objectivity in what they're looking at. In our program area, we have regional advisors who are assigned half a dozen or so of these local areas, and we have project managers who are responsible for ensuring that the deliverables are met for the grants that we give to community-based organizations. So you can't characterize them purely as oversight and monitoring per se, but there are eyes on the ground. There are hands helping them to take necessary corrective actions if they're not meeting our expectations, if they're not meeting the deliverables. I think that they could be a key piece of this, the ideas that were expressed earlier about risk assessments. They're kind of our first response. They're the ones who are working with these grantees, and they can help to identify if they see any problems.
Thank you. Any other questions from the panel? Yes, Mr. Rambula.
As I heard your testimony, there is not an instance where funds have been reallocated because you have worked with them and provided the technical assistance and so on. Have there been instances where you have used incentive or sanction policies to motivate better performance?
Well, the Workforce Investment Act actually requires the governor to establish incentive policies. There's two different types. One is based upon the performance levels, entered employments, retained employments, and average wages. Goals are set. Whether you met them or not would allow a local area to be qualified for an incentive. There's also another type of incentive that is related to regional collaboration and local coordination of services, and it's somewhat of a competitive approach where we ask for local areas to submit proposals to talk about how they will work with their partners, whether they be federal, state, or local agencies, to make better use of the funds. So there are incentive policies there. We do have some sanctions in the way of administrative guidance that says if a grantee is not meeting certain thresholds, or they're either not spending their money, and I'm talking again about the 15% grants to community-based organizations, if they're not meeting expenditure thresholds, if they're not meeting participant levels that they said they would in their proposals, then we have the authority to take those monies back. That's really not something we want to do. We would rather work with them to make sure that they're helping the people in the communities, because these grants that we put out are targeting needy populations, or they're trying to put people into jobs that are seen as demand or growth opportunities. And so we really want to make the projects work if at all possible.
And are there any reports that detail noncompliance, or is that something that you work it out and then end of story?
Well, the regional advisors or the project managers have trip reports, their internal, administrative memos to their management team. That goes up the chain. As we heard earlier, there are compliance monitoring reports that the other side of the EDD House does for local boards and now for community-based organizations.
So if there is one, it's an internal document, is what I'm hearing.
For the project management aspect, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, I do want to thank members of this panel. I do want to thank you for your leadership and oversight in helping us to achieve the objectives of the ARA money and the ongoing WIA and WIB project. Thank you for your service to the people of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
And we'll ask our third panel to come forward. As they come forward, I want to welcome Assemblymember Jeffries, who's joined us. Welcome. You came to the right place. And as our panel members get seated, I do want to welcome you this afternoon and offer the same admonition I offered our prior panels. 5 to 7 minutes would be our hope for your affirmative testimony, and then we'll have an opportunity for some exchange. We have listed on our agenda Jennifer Mitchell with the California Workforce Association leading off. Welcome, Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committees. I'm Jennifer Mitchell. I'm with the California Workforce Association, and CWA represents California's 49 workforce investment boards and career centers throughout the state. I'm joined today by two of CWA's board members, Blake Consul, who represents the Fresno Regional Workforce Investment Board, and Kathy Kosick, who's with the Sacramento City and County Workforce Investment Board. I'd like to spend just a few minutes providing some statewide perspective, and then I'll turn it over to Blake and to Kathy. So just for some context, the workforce investment boards are administratively housed based on the direction of the chief local elected official in each area. Some are housed in economic development agencies, some in social service agencies, some exist as joint powers agreements. The designated grant recipient and administrator for funding, both WIA funding and RF funding, is decided by a local partnership between the chief local elected official and the local board, which the chief local elected official actually appoints. Just quickly in terms of demographics and the number of people walking through the doors of the career centers. We've seen a huge increase throughout the state, as much as fivefold in some areas, but 91% of the workforce investment boards have reported between a 25% and 200% increase over the past year. And the majority of people we have heard from said that the largest increases are actually, strangely enough, at either 25% or 100%. One example is the San Diego Career Centers have served 90,000 customers in the last 6 months, which is absolutely astonishing. I know that this hearing is about expenditure levels and a couple of other issues. I'll get to that. We polled our members just last week because the data that we have is old. And 97% of the workforce investment boards responding said that they're on target to meet the 70% expenditure guidelines by September 30th, 2010. There are different policies around accounting practices that govern how funding is accrued and drawn down locally. So an administrative agency may be choosing to use local general funds or Workforce Investment Act funds prior to RF funds and then drawing down RF funds at the end of a quarter. So the WIB directors often have no control over the day-to-day accounting practices, but they are in fact, ultimately responsible for the proper use of funds. Also, it's important to note that when you look comprehensively at WIB's funding streams and activities, that you do take into account more than the RF funding, and I think some other folks hit on this earlier. WIA assumes that WIBs will collaborate with other agencies and that they will leverage other resources, and I think on your next panel you'll hear from somebody who has over 40 funding sources in their area. In terms of accountability, we've heard a lot about that today. The boards have to follow rules and guidance by the Department of Labor, the Office of Management and Budget, the Employment Development Department, local elected officials, and others. And so I think there are layers and layers and layers of accountability. If something's missed in one audit or review, it will be found in another. I'm not going to go into performance standards. We've heard about those at length. I will talk about good jobs briefly. There's been some criticism and some questions today as to whether or not the jobs being found for people are good jobs, whether or not training leads to good wages and jobs. I think it's interesting to report, and you may know this, but every workforce investment board has a policy for self-sufficiency, a self-sufficiency standard. 70% of WIBs reported that their self-sufficiency standard is at 40,000 or above. I think it's pretty good. I hope our labor friends hope so as well. Also, in terms of training, our members do a lot of labor market research. They work with employer groups and others to ensure that any training, even if it's initially not for a high-wage job, that it will lead to career ladders where maybe you're training somebody to be a CNA and then next an LVN and then an RN, so that they're moving up those career ladders. So, and in terms of training, virtually all workforce investment boards have policies to guide those investments to ensure that that is in fact happening. It's difficult in this economy, but it is what they're working on. We do have a list of recommendations that have been provided in our formal testimony, and I won't go into those unless you want me to do that now. So with that, unless you have questions, I will turn it over to Mr. Gosel.
Great. Thank you. We'll have some questions after the panel. Thank you. Mr. Gosel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Blake Consul, and I'm the director for the Fresno Regional Workforce Investment Board. In being asked to speak today, they asked us to give our local perspective, and I guess local perspective could be broken into two parts. Me briefly talking about what's happening in our local area, and then secondly, how do we kind of view the food chain that occurs above us. Involving our local area, and I think this is really important because I know some of the earlier presenters, I guess in a way to try to make things seem polite, kept talking about accounting issues in the Central Valley, accounting issues for the Central Valley. Well, Fresno is the capital of the Central Valley, and we don't have those accounting issues. We're the largest WIB in the Central Valley. Our budget is more than all the other WIBs combined. The number of clients that we serve are more than all the other WIBs from Stockton all the way down to Bakersfield combined. We do have separate breakouts in budgets to make distinctions between overhead for leasing space for youth centers and how much money we spend on actually training kids. That's kind of a common practice that probably happens in the majority of WIBs in the state. We received about a little bit over $16 million in ARA funding, $7 million of which was for youth, and then the remainder, about $9 million, was for adults. That would be what's termed adult, and under the old law used to be called poor adult because there's an income test for it, and then dislocated workers, people who were laid off from their most recent job. Of the $9 million in ARA funding that we have received, 44% of that money, or a little bit over $4 million, we are spending directly on training. And by training, I mean real training, ITAs, vouchers, sending people to school. So not only are we spending the money in a legally compliant way, meaning in a timely fashion, but we're also spending a very large percentage of it on direct training of our clients. Before the ARA funding, with our regular, the LAO's office used the form base funding. In WIA speak, local areas refer to it as formula funding because it's based on that federal formula. We've always had a training set aside in Fresno, even with our regular money, and we try to make sure that a substantial portion of what we spend is actually being spent directly on sending people to school. So at that local level, we are spending our money, we think, in the best way, not just in a legal way. We're spending it in a timely fashion. We will have expended 70% of our stimulus money by June the 30th, not by September the 30th. If you want to give us more money, we'll spend that on time too. That's not the problem. So at the local level, I don't really think that there's a problem with the money being expended in a timely fashion, and I think the system, and I think the EDD is set up in a way that the money will be expended in a timely fashion. But the second part of the question, which is how do we view what's happening above us, I can't answer because I'd have to ask you another question, and that is, if you're talking about legal compliance or contractual compliance with the feds, that's one question, and it's a good question. It's the starting question. But the better question is money in local areas being spent optimally or in the best way? And when you ask that question, the federal rules that get put upon us, see, it's possible to view the federal rules as a ceiling. Once we achieve compliance with those federal rules, we're done. In actuality, the federal rules are a foundation. And so local areas in the federal law and the state are encouraged to go beyond minimum federal requirements to try to spend the money in a better way. That then becomes a policy question. Policy question is supposed to get addressed by our local board in Fresno for the money we control directly. Policy question is supposed to get addressed by the state WIB at the state level, and also that's supposed to get addressed by you all at the legislature. I don't think it's fair to try to dink the EDD, the Employment Development Department. Their focus is the legal and contractual compliance at the state level and then how the locals are performing. The policy question by definition is something we address with our local board, the state WIB should address, and you all should address. So really you've been talking about two things today. One, legal contractual compliance. You might want to have a separate hearing to talk about if the money is being spent optimally, because that's the real question. Not just are we doing what's legal with it, but are we doing what's best with it?
Well, thank you for your testimony. We will follow up with some questions. Some of our earlier questions did try to ask about not just compliance, but where are the trends in jobs, et cetera? Are we using this stimulus to position ourselves for the growth of California's economy? But we'll come back to that. Our third panelist on this panel, Ms. Kosick, Executive Director, Sacramento Employment and Training Agency. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I wanted to give you a local perspective of what we've done with the Recovery Act money. We received approximately $14 million in Recovery Act money to date. And through February, we've spent 50.2%.
Work to Future has taken advantage of ARA's provisions to send not one or two trainees at a time, but to send a large group of job seekers to training as cohorts, if you will, who are experiencing the same kind of pressures and concerns in their lives, instead of the traditional way of sending them one or two at a time. We are also obtaining information, as many are, on clean, green, and other high-demand occupancy training programs we are providing that could allow for a client within a short time frame to realize, with the help of higher institutions of learning and other training providers, a substantial boost in the likelihood of not only initial retraining for new employment, but retention for the long-term investment. And we additionally have used some of the stimulus dollars of IRA to develop new programs, as you heard from Mr. Diaz, for re-apprenticeship and other green programs. These programs, design and new partnerships, take time, and we know they will take time, but they are certainly worth what we see as a success rate. The innovation will serve our current and future clients and focus sectors where we expect as a state and locally for jobs in the future to not only occur now, but to be sustainable. We think it's important to point out that our workforce investment effort, Work for the Future, is one of only 12 learning laboratories in California. Anyone who wants to enroll in those programs can do so. We don't pre-select the clients or exclude an individual from participating in that learning experience. In fact, we think this is a good measurement. Some of you had talked about how do we measure your success rate, etc. We think that this is a good measurement, since we are not pre-selecting, a great indicator of a job that we are doing well in training and preparing people for employment. And lastly, if I might, I'd like to close by, many of you serve in other capacities with other committees. And I think it's so important that if we are in California are going to get this right and realize success, we need to recognize the partnerships that exist at the local level, not only with the state. And certainly would want to reference the opportunities for economic and redevelopment that are afforded in the state by a strong redevelopment program. The redevelopment has the capacity at the local level to lead the way with businesses and public partners, including higher education, to make certain that we are planning and employing for the future. And in addition to that, of course, our labor partners, our business partners. So with that, and enterprise zone programs as well. We must look at all these again, be smart about what we're doing if we're going to succeed. So on behalf of our mayor and city council, we appreciate very much. We welcome the opportunity to work with you so we can maximize our effort collectively. Thank you.
Ms. Miller, thank you so much. Let me just see if anyone has questions for you, but I just want to thank you for so wonderfully representing the city of San Jose and the accomplishments of the city of San Jose and the Work for the Future programs. And I do appreciate your offering the linkage to some of the other issues that we're looking at in budget considerations and how that very directly relates to workforce development in retaining employment levels. So thank you very much. Questions for Ms. Miller? Thank you so much. Any other public comment? Seeing none, I do want to see if there's a closing comment from our co-chairs.
Chairman, I wanted to thank you and Senator DeSaulnier for pulling this together. And today's hearing has reinforced my growing belief in the benefit of having policy committees work with budget committees. And as I will be leaving this year, although the two of you will hopefully stay here for a good amount of time to come, I hope that you will share this belief in the benefit of having policy committees serve as part of the oversight process that the budget committees do. I see a tremendous benefit, and I think it's essential that we reassume the role that unfortunately in prior years we have let go of doing oversight and being involved with not just legal or technical compliance, but as one of the speakers said, looking for optimal results. I think our constituents are asking us to do that, and I hope that we can rearrange our internal House rules to allow for more of this type of a hearing to occur on a regular basis. So thank both of you.
Thank you, Mr. Arambula. Senator DeSaulnier?
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that those comments include working with the Senate in a bicameral fashion, because after all, we're not the enemy, right, Mr.
Yeah.
It's an inside joke, sorry.
Well, I do want to thank both of my co-chairs. I also want to particularly thank the staff from the three committees that have coordinated today. The staff has done the person's labor preparing us for today. I want to thank all of you who participated as panel members or as observers this afternoon. We look forward to our continued collaboration and work with you. And with that, we will stand in adjournment. Thank you.